Welcome to the Water Shelf Podcast, where we dive into the wonderful world of water books. The Water Shelf is a production of Maven's Notebook, California's Water News Central. My name is Justin Scott-Coe, water manager, pirate, and book aficionado. More information on the Water Shelf and Maven's Notebook will be provided at the end of this episode. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Giulio Boccaletti to the Water Shelf Podcast. Dr. Boccaletti is the Scientific Director of Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change Foundation, co-founder of Chloris Geospatial, a venture-backed geospatial analytics company, Honorary Research Associate at the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at the University of Oxford, and executive producer of the upcoming PBS BBC Studios series, The Future of Nature. His extensive resume includes NASA Earth Systems Science Fellow at Princeton University, where he earned his PhD, research scientist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, partner and water practice co-founder at McKinsey & Company, and chief strategy officer at the Nature Conservancy. I am excited to talk with him today about his book, Water, a Biography, published in 2021 by Pantheon Books, which has been translated into several languages and was named by The Economist as one of the best books of 2021. His second book, Siccità, published by Mondadori in 2023, is about the drought and floods that hit Italy in 2022 and 2023. And he is currently working on his third book, which I hope to hear more about during our interview. Giulio, I am thrilled to speak with you today. Thank you so much for being on our podcast.
Thank you, Justin. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Well, my first question before we get into the book's content is how you came about to write Water, a Biography. What got you interested in writing this that very unique book? And then I'm also interested in who you consider to be your intended audience, or who do you most want to read this book?
Well, that's a great question, and it's a long story, but I'll try to give you a short answer. I think I started out life as a scientist and quantitative, right? And water for me was the expression of the climate system on the landscape. Where it rains or where it doesn't rain is simply the manifestation of how the planet's atmosphere organizes itself. And then I got into more real world water problems of the sort that you encounter every day, Justin. And I went from appreciating the issue of water as a scientific issue into understanding its more complicated engineering and economics aspects, how people allocate this resource to do whatever they need to do in their society, in their communities, water supply for urban developments, water for energy, water for agriculture. And so very quickly you get into a conversation about economics and kind of community development, if you will. But then there's another stage as I got into the field, and I spent a fair amount of time working both with countries on kind of national water planning and infrastructure development. And then, when I was working at the Nature Conservancy, a lot with communities that were dealing with, this kind of tension between nature and conservation and community objectives. As I did more of that, I realized that water at the end is not just about science, it's not just about economics, it's about us. It's about our relationship to our home, how we live in the landscape that we inhabit, what's our relationship with both the power, the destructive power, what surrounds us, but also the wealth that it can give us. And it's really a matter of story. What story do we tell ourselves about what surrounds us? So you're in California, right? In Los Angeles, and the incredible story, the Mulholland story and the development of Los Angeles and the relationship to the Colorado and to the Imperial Valley and to the canals, the American Canal, all of that story. That's a story. It's a story of development that sort of starts with John Wesley Powell and ends with, it hasn't ended yet, right? I mean, you're still living it. And so I sort of over the years, I came to recognize the power and importance of story. And really the book was an attempt to tell a story of water, right? To start with kind of what it means for us as human beings, and not in a moralistic or sort of ethical sense, but in a broader civilizational and political sense, if you will. So that's what I was trying to talk about. And then who am I writing for? Well, that's a great question. I mean, authors, I sort of my little world, I sort of think of myself as a wannabe author, and I fear that, I mean, at some level, you're writing for yourself when you're writing a book, in the sense that you're trying to organize your thoughts. There's a need there to communicate something, right? And so, but I do think that I'm trying to write to and for the people that I encountered over my years working on these issues, right? So I'm trying to give, I think I'm trying to give words to people to talk about water, not just in narrow scientific terms or in narrow conflict terms, but in historical and identity terms. I think that's important. I think understanding where you come from is an important part of figuring out where you're going to go, right? And so certainly for the general public, and certainly for the water community, people like yourself who have this feeling that water really matters in a very special way, and are constantly frustrated by the fact that people don't seem to understand it. They seem to think that water is something that somebody with a white coat gets, sorts out, right? So that we don't have to worry about it. So I think I'm writing for them. I'm writing for you in a sense. I'm writing for people who understand that water is important and are just trying to figure out a way of expressing it.
I think that's a wonderful way of putting it. I felt that way reading the book. It was just like, wow, this is really speaking to all of the various aspects of water that a non-technical person who is involved in interrelationships and managing water. And it's interesting you mentioned story, which I want to come back to. Right next to my desk in my office, I've got a big poster of Chinatown, a movie poster of Chinatown. It's actually from an Italian movie poster, which I love that movie. And oftentimes people enter into the water, question from stories or from what they hear about water. And oftentimes we have to almost re-educate folks. That's what they hear is not exactly
Yeah,
what is in fact the case, and yet it's very hard to convince people because they feel so close to water, right? We're made of this stuff, right? We're
yeah,
surrounded
yeah.
by it in many ways.
And if I may, Justin, I mean, I'd add one thing, which is we live in a very unusual era for society, for humanity, right? I mean, you think about, the story of the book is a long civilizational story, right? So it's a 10,000 year journey. And if you said, well, what's unusual about the last, let's say, 60, 70 years, is that most people don't have to worry about water most of the time. Certainly, it's true where you and I come from, right? I mean, this is not true for everybody on the planet, but it's certainly true for people who live in rich, wealthy societies. And water is simply not a dominant concern for their life. Now, this is a new feeling, right? I mean, William Faulkner used to talk about the Mississippi as that river that enters your living room and takes away the piano with it, right? That was the experience of water until very recently. I mean, that essay he wrote in the 1950s. So in Italy or in the US in the 1950s, you still had plenty of people who lived on the land, who were part of a farming community, and for whom water was a constant preoccupation. And then over the last, let's say our generations, over the last 40, 50, 60 years, we've gotten into this world in which we don't wade a river on the way to work or school. If we have to get water, we open a tap. Nobody goes to an outhouse. And that has changed the nature of the relationship between water and society. Now, society as a whole still has the same powerful relationship with the stuff, right? I mean, we still have to control its force. We still have to harness its power. We still have to deliver it where we need it. It's just that we've created institutions like public utilities to
Yep.
do that for us so that we don't have to worry about it. And so that's a very unusual situation to be in, because very, very few hold the keys of security for many. And so in a way, telling the story matters also for that, right? It's people have to realize that really important choices about their life are being made through very technical discussions. And so that's another angle that I suppose was in the background as I was writing this thing.
So true. I mean, we're living through that right now in California with the wildfires, the all of a sudden water not coming out of fire hydrants, the reason for that,
Yeah,
what you build a system to take care of and what it can't take care of. I mean, this is a very active conversation, and we're not very good at it.
yeah.
Is my initial impression.
Well, and we're not good at it partly because I think, sorry, I'm derailing
No,
your line of questioning
I
here,
find
but
this fascinating.
I do think it's important to realize, and maybe your listeners, those who work in water will recognize this, that the answer, of course, is not technical, right? I mean, there's a technical element to this, but at the end of the day, it's a question of what matters to you, what matters to us as a community, right? That's the
Exactly.
question. What risks are we willing to take? And it's not like because we haven't engaged in the conversation, we haven't made the choice. We have made the choice whether we want or not, right? And so there's no. I mean, I've always thought of this. There's no right answer in water. There's only a legitimate answer. And the legitimate answer is the one that comes from a collective decision. People are aware of the risks they're facing, and then they make a choice, right? And that's what we're losing by assuming that somebody's taking care of it, is we're just delegating that choice. There's no right choice. I mean, the fires, having water to, combat catastrophic fires. I mean, you can build for anything, so you can build for that too. It's a choice. It costs money. Somebody has to pay for it, right? So it's a matter of choices. And I think we're making choices with imperfect information at the moment and imperfect engagement. And that's really the crux of the matter, right? Is technical staff know what's going on, but at the end of the day, the choices are political. They are so fundamental about the community. They're not technical engineering choices.
You're telling the story of my life here. This all strikes me right at the heart. The phrase that I use in my head is the community standard. What is the community standard? And that's the job of my elected board to communicate to us, and then we will provide to that community standard. That's our job. But it doesn't really adequately describe what you're talking about. Let's pull back to your book because and I think it's very connected what you're saying. But I before we get into its content, I did want to ask you. I'm very curious about the idea of the title and where that came from. Water, a biography. It's obviously difficult conceptually to get your head around a biography of a physical element, but your book in no way anthropomorphizes water. It instead focuses on humanity's collective engagement with water through what you call, and you just now called, a story of water and people. It's a story. So is this what you mean by water's biography? And another kind of sub question is, would you consider water a biography, a political biography of water? Because politics is such an important aspect of this story as you tell it.
Yeah. Well, I suppose the answer to these two questions is connected. I mean, first of all, there's just a very practical point, which is it's a funny old process of landing a title for a book, and it's a conversation with the editor, and so at some point I had like 30 different titles that I could have gone with, and Water Biography rang true for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, it's kind of straightforward. The book is about water, and so that's, it says, it does what it says in the tin, as it were. The biography element of this is indeed, as you say, it's not an attempt at personifying or anthropomorphizing water. It's a story of, I mean, in truth, it's a story of a relationship. It's a story of life. I mean, strictly speaking, is the kind of story of life, right? But it's a story of our life and our relationship with water. So it's the life that I care about is our own life as we relate to water. And so that's kind of the meaning of the title. There are other books out there that attempt to turn the camera around and put the water as the subject. But in my experience of working on water, the story is about us, right? I mean, in the end, because water, what we experience of water is not the molecule. The molecule is interesting, and you can have a conversation about the molecule. I'm a scientist by training, so I enjoy, like any other scientist, the nerdy details of the molecule that is water, which is kind of interesting in sorts of ways. But that's not the point. The point is how we experience water as a community is really the product of choices that we make. Water over here is different than water over there, and we ensure that it gets there. Whether or not a flood comes through is a matter of how we decide to use the landscape, of where we decide to live, right? And so it's really about the biography element of the story is really about our relationship to this substance. And I would posit, and I say this in the book, it's a dialectic relationship, and maybe we'll come back to this. So it's an ever transforming relationship where each move by one party changes the other, right? So you're never done. It's a very dynamic relationship. It is political, not in the sense of party political, obviously. I mean, I'm not making any claim about, who's right or wrong, or what's the ideological framing that one should read this through. I think it's political because it recognizes that water happens on the landscape at dimensions that transcend the individual. And so for that very banal point, right, which is clouds rain water on you at a size that's greater than your garden, right? And they typically, rivers flow through properties and don't particularly care about our property lines or our administrative structures. Water requires a collective response. It requires coordination. It requires mobilizing what Michael Mann, the historian, used to describe as the sources of social power, right? So how do we become more than the sum of parts? How do we get organized and build a levee together that none of us individually would be able to build, but collectively we can deliver, right? These are typical expressions of social power. And so it's political in that sense, in the sense that anything that we do together on the landscape, anything material, anything that involves choices about where we live, what we build around us, what defenses we choose to build together, all of that requires negotiation, requires debate, and that is the heart of politics. Politics, in the end, is about finding a synthesis between different points of view until you come to some collective answer. You see this in the West all the time. Water is political. Everybody understands this, but it's not political in a party political sense. It's political because there's not a lot of it, and you have to decide who gets it. It's as simple as that. And of course, you could fight it out, right? But that's what we choose to do. What we choose to do is we build institutions that help us find some synthesis, even when we disagree. Right? The trick of politics is not everybody ends up agreeing. The trick of politics is people that disagree find a way of living together. That's the heart of politics. And so in water, that happens all the time. And so in that sense, that is political. And, the good thing about water is there's no substitute. So it's not like you can buy yourself out of needing water. You need water, whether you have money or you don't have any, And so in that sense, it's a very political book because it puts at the heart of the story how we as communities end up making those choices together.
So what would you say is the thesis or the central argument of the book of Water, a Biography, if you were to identify one?
Well, I think that there's a hierarchy of thesis. At the heart of it, the premise is water. We have a dialectic relationship with water. So part of the question is, how do you describe that? And the reason I spend a fair amount of time doing that is that there are precursors to this book, and in particular, there's a famous thesis called the Hydraulic Society, which was proposed in the 50s by Karl Wittfogel, who was an anthropologist at the time at Columbia. He was German. He had fled Nazi Germany and arrived in the United States, and ended up writing this book that, for an academic book by an anthropologist, was incredibly successful. It was printed many times, and it was called Oriental Despotism. And in this book, he argued, I'm going to simplify radically for effect, but he was basically saying, look at China, it's a despotic regime. Look at, all these countries around the world that have despotic regimes. They all tend to have big rivers, the ancient Egypt, Mesopotamia. Is there a relationship between despotism and the hydrology that they face? And the basic argument was that there's a certain kind of hydrology, typically monsoonal or tropical hydrology, that requires a very heavy-handed intervention by the state, and that ensures that you never really develop industrialization, that you remain this kind of despotic regime of many, many poor farmers, collective little, productive units locally, and then a big state that builds the levees and the likes. And the model was the Chinese imperial government, and then Mao's government subsequently. Now, the challenge with Wittfogel's argument is it's a very narrowly materialistic argument. He was a Marxist, a very sophisticated Marxist. He was he was a student of Marxist China. He wrote the book on the so-called Asiatic mode of production, which was the thing that Marx wrote very little about, but then people took out these few references that he made and made an industry out of it. And so there's a lot of writing on this Asiatic mode of production, which was exactly this problem. How come that industrialization didn't happen in Russia, and how come China hadn't developed for centuries? Now, of course, they would be baffled by what we see today, but at the time it was still relevant questions. So he wrote this book, but it was a very deterministic book. I mean, today we would say it was an environmental deterministic book. It said the conditions determine what happens. And so my book, in a way, is a response to that. And it says it's a dialectic relationship. So the one doesn't determine the other, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't matter, right? Often the mistake we make in negating determinism, in saying, oh, no, these determinists have it all wrong, right? Because we have free will. We can't, surely the conditions don't uniquely determine what we do. That's true. But even if we have free will, there are boundaries, constraints that we operate within. And in water, those constraints do have some role in the development of the institutions, particularly the political institutions that we live with. And then in turn, those political institutions transform the landscape, right? You could argue that that's exactly the story of the Western United States, right? I mean, you have this push towards the West. John Wesley Powell comes along and says we need the state here to make this land livable. San Diego can only 10,000 people can live in San Diego if you didn't have the kind of infrastructure we have. So let's build infrastructure. The infrastructure gets built. California becomes the garden of the United States, and of course that changes the politics of California and of the United States. Power shifts, because water bestows power on people in some ways, particularly if you have an agricultural society, right? And now, ironically, with data centers, also in a highly technological society. So so part of the book, at the heart of it, the thesis, most of the book is about explaining this dialectic relationship and demonstrating through time that it exists and that you can see it, not in the way water determined the outcome, but in the way in which people responding to water conditions evolve political institutions that then in turn change those water conditions, right? And so I talk about democracy, I talk about the Roman experience, I talk about China and India, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of the heart of the matter. But then there's also, hidden in the folds of the book, there's also somewhat of a thesis that's more than a diagnosis. I don't just diagnose that there's a dialectic relationship. I also have a thesis which I'm now actually expounding on further in the new book that I'm writing, which is that water shows us why republicanism is so important. Republicanism, not the good old party republicanism, but republicanism as an institutional form, right? So big R republic, and in a way, I mean, the fortunes of the American century are built on this premise, right? The republic, which is an institutional form that, in its modern description, originates with Rome, right, with ancient Rome. But I would venture to say that it's actually much more frequently found in human societies than we might initially think. I mean, people think that it's a Eurocentric answer, right? But it's actually not true, and that's part of the subject of my new book. But the Republic is the institution that's born to mediate between individual liberty and individual interests and responsibility and collective intent and collective purpose and project, right? So how do you build a society in which you both have people who have free will and have liberty and are free to operate in the landscape and private property and so forth and so on, but at the same time have a collective project, right? That at the same time are more than the sum of the parts. And this feels very abstract until you actually confront water, where this is exactly the problem.
Exactly.
I have my home, I have my garden, I have my kitchen, but if I want water to come out of the tap, I need to somehow build an infrastructure that is shared with all my neighbors so that we all get water at a sensible price, right? I mean, it becomes even very, very, practical and everyday, right? But at the heart of this is the idea that you need a set of political institutions that do these two things, that both preserve individual liberty and at the same time enable collective purpose. And so I would say that Republican institutions are the heart of are the way in which human society has found a way of solving most effectively the problem of environmental management more generally, but water management more specifically. And the fact that people don't really talk about the Republic today, the fact that people have lost track of this, so that it seems like all we're talking about is 19th century obsessions with liberalism or socialism, libertarianism. We're still missing the plot, because meanwhile, the landscape is shaped by forces that transcend the individual, but that can be controlled by society. And so it's evident that the answer is somewhere in the middle, right? And we have an answer for that. It's called the Republic. You know, you live in the oldest continuously running, large republic on the planet, and people don't quite recognize this. You know, with all its complexity, and mediation is the heart of a Republican project. So there's a thesis there that says we ought to be spending more time thinking about Republican institutions if we want to confront the changes that are coming, and in particular deal with the water problems that we have.
That was exactly where many of my questions were headed, is that it very much seems to, you seem to focus on, how can this Republican form of government, which seems to have been evolved to best manage situations such as water management, can continue to do so. As you said, the dialectic continues to go back and forth, and you give such wonderful examples, incredibly well researched and just informative. I learned so much out of the book about the Chinese experience with managing water, which you kind of bookend your book with, that experience of constructing and even nature testing the Three Gorges Dam, the largest ever built. But you also go into the Tennessee Valley Authority and its incredible influence in international development, or attempts at international development, even to export the Valley Authority idea, and so on. They're just amazing. I was wondering on the Chinese experience, because it holds such an important or serves an important role in your narrative at the beginning and as at the end. Why is this one infrastructure project so important to understanding water's full biography? Not so much in a technical sense, but almost more in a narrative sense.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose that in a way, there's the multiple pieces to this answer. I mean, at some level, China's response to its water challenges was not significant, right? I mean, they have massive rivers, they're monsoonal, there's an East Asian monsoon, there's an Indian monsoon. The nature of the precipitation over the landscape means that China has always been very susceptible to water catastrophes, right? And then the largest flooding ever happened in the world that we know of was the 1931 floods of the Yangtze and Yellow, where it's estimated that anywhere between 400,000 and 4 million people perished. I mean, you're talking about uh, catastrophes that we don't, in sort of European tradition, we just simply don't face, right? I mean, we don't have that kind of experience. It matters because on the one hand, there's no interruption between the American experience of the 20th century and the Chinese experience of the 21st century. The Three Gorges Dam, believe it or not, is a product of American experience. As a matter of fact, the original project for the Three Gorges Dam was an American project. The first billion-dollar engineer, who's I forget his name now, but I think it was Frank Johnson. I forget his name, but he was an engineer that worked on the TVA, on Muscle Shoals, actually, on the TVA dam. Did the first plan in that location, actually, in the early 1940s. And it was commissioned when the government in China was the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek. So it was still close to America. This was the time when, we were switching to the Truman administration, and there was this idea that the great experience of development of the West and of the Tennessee Valley Authority could be the shibboleth that Americans could take around the world. It was development in a box, right? So you could essentially, given that you'd proven that the West of the United States could be developed, and you could prove that Tennessee's fortunes had been transformed by this approach to water control and water management, you could export this idea. And the Yangtze was supposed to be one of those places. So the Yangtze was supposed to have a river authority like the Tennessee River Authority, a large utility that would own all the assets, and the crown jewel would be this dam at Three Gorges. That project then was, and like that was the first project was American. As a matter of fact, the motivation for that first project goes even back further in China. It was Sun Yat-sen, the father of the Chinese Republic, who had trained in Anglo-Saxon schools and actually had a brother who lived in Hawaii. This was slightly before Hawaii becomes part of the United States, but nonetheless was exposed to the success of the American story and imagined the Yangtze playing the role in China that the Mississippi played in the United States, right? And he imagined building large infrastructure, including maybe taking advantage of these large, gorges that we have in the mid-stem of the Yangtze. We would probably build dams, right? This was the great era of dam building. Hoover Dam is more or less at the same time as Sun Yat-sen is writing this. So the origin of the Three Gorges Dam is America. Then it gets delivered by the Chinese state at the end of the 20th century, under budget and under time. This is an incredible piece of infrastructure. I mean, if you go there, aside from the judgment of whether it's a good thing or bad thing to build dams, I mean, you sit there and, I've been more than once, and, to think that somebody could look over this river and decide to build something like this is mind-boggling, right? There's nobody in the West today, nobody in Europe, nobody in America that has had the experience of building something of that scale, right? And so that's important, because part of the American prowess in engineering around the world was the experience, the real world experience of building large projects, right? Which, in our generation, nobody has really ever done. And we've seen the difficulties that we have in spending money on infrastructure now, right? So so part of the reason I bookend the book is that with the story is, if the Republic is this kind of fundamental piece of institutional architecture, isn't it interesting that China begins its journey as with a Republican theorist? Sun Yat-sen is a Republican theorist, right? He is part of the movement to get rid of the emperor, establish the Chinese Republic. Then the Chinese Republic, of course, takes this communist and planned economy turn, but it is a Republican project in its origin. Well, so isn't it interesting? That's where it comes from. First point. Second point is that now China has become what America used to be in the 20th century, which is the plumber in charge of the world, right? I mean, most infrastructure projects that have to do with water in developing countries today are delivered by Chinese contractors and Chinese planners. Sino-Hydro, Power China, these are the companies with hundreds of thousands of employees that go around the world and build the infrastructure for Africa. And if you think about Africa as an example, when I was writing the book, now I think is not particularly more advanced. Africa had only really exploited, less than 10% of its hydropower potential. They look around the world, they look at the US, they look at Europe, they look increasingly at China, and these countries have developed, and, what a coincidence, they also developed about 70% of their hydropower potential. Now, I'm not suggesting that hydropower plays the same role in our energy mix that it did in the 20th century, right? I mean, we have different technology, but there's still a lot to do, for good or for bad, and China is taking the leadership. So if you ask yourself, if I'm an alien and I'm sitting on the moon looking down on the planet, and I'm asking myself, who's changing stuff here that I can see from space? Well, it's China, right? So the reason I then end the book with China is because, I mean, that's the lever that's transforming our relationship to water today, and we have to reckon with that. And I think it's inseparable from the current debate about geopolitics, from the trade discussions and trade difficulties that we're currently having. That's not separable from the role that China plays in replumbing itself and the world. And so that's why China plays this prominent role in the story.
And as you said at the end of the book, the story of water, principally a story of political institutions. And so there's this struggle of political institutions and this overriding question that you pose about whether the institutions, whether they be waning Republican, but still very much alive Republican institutions, or rising authoritarian ones, which ones will be most effective in addressing climate change, right?
Yes, and I think that's the heart of the matter. Sorry, Justin, if I
No,
interrupt you,
please. Teeing you up.
You got me excited on this particular question, because I think I think that's the crux of the matter, right? If you look at the world of water through the lens of an engineer, solely the lens of an engineer, then Three Gorges Dam is simply a larger version of Hoover Dam. I mean, not technically, in that they're completely different infrastructure, but one's a gravity dam, the other's an arch dam. But the idea is basically, it's a dam. I understand the civil engineering principles, the hydraulic engineering principles, and so they kind of, okay, the same answer to a similar question. But in reality, they are completely different solutions, because one is delivered as an exercise of power of an authoritarian regime over its people. 1.5 million people were moved out of the way to make room for the lake that goes from Yicheng to Chongqing, and that's impounded by Three Gorges Dam. Those people, I mean, when you go to see the Three Gorges Dam, they take you to a visitor center. They show a little movie of just how delighted those 1.5 million people were to be moved from where they lived to where they are. But I can guarantee you that that is not a symptom of liberty, right? And so, whereas, go back to the experience of the 20th century in the United States, and I'm not naive. I recognize that there were power imbalances in the United States at the time. There still are, right? And not everybody was free in the same way, and so forth and so on. But the framing of the problem is very different, because the replumbing of the West, you know, is an expression of sovereignty of the people of the West. Now, maybe not of all people of the West, but of many of the people of the West, right? It was in service of a collective project of development. Now, was it fair? Was it just? Was it equally distributed? No, like life's complicated, right? But I think that the political framing of those two projects couldn't be more different. Couldn't be more different. And to wit, even, all the ancillary institutional pieces that made that possible. Think of the Colorado Compact, right? A negotiation, if there ever was one, if you were in China, you'd have a very different, you wouldn't need Hoover to come along and negotiate between the states what's the apportionment of water between the upper riparian and the lower riparian states, right? And so the primacy of political negotiation is really at the heart of the solutions in the American West, in the much of the European experience, although not all of it, right? I mean, think of Franco's Spain, for example, built all dams. None of them were the expression of sovereignty of the Spanish people. But you know what I mean? So if you just look at it from a narrow engineering perspective, you might be fooled into thinking that you're just looking at different iterations of the same basic point, which is people dam a river. But politically, these are remarkably different projects. And the challenge before us is people are going to be more infrastructure going forward. We're going to have to make very hard choices. I mean, you saw this in LA, right? We're going to have to make choices. Things are changing. I mean, it's empirical. And even if you don't believe it, I can guarantee, I mean, I've been working on these things for a long time. I'm pretty chill about the problem of proving that it's happening, because it's just the reality will play out, right? I'm not worried that this will become self-evident. I don't particularly care or worry about whether the debate about what, who's doing what, and it's just going to happen. It is happening. The question is, what do we do about it? And there's no question that part of the answer is going to have to be interventions in the landscape, as we did in the 20th century. In the 20th century is a vast process of adaptation to climate conditions. It took people in 1900 who basically had a river going through their living room, and it took us to the 1975, 80s period where all of us never waded a river on the way to work and got water out of the tap 24/7, right? That transformation and adaptation, it required choices. It required collective money. It required going into debt. It required building things. It required, in some cases, exercising eminent domain and taking land out of private property to serve the collective good. Now, we have a choice. Do we want an authoritarian political system to do that? Or do we want a republican system to do that, where, the principle of sovereignty of the people, if you will allow me a moment of romanticism, matters. And I think it does matter. And so I think it's a very profound choice. And water is the canary in the mine for this conversation. And so that's why I think the counterpoint to China is so important.
It's a fundamental choice, and I can see why you're so excited, not only in writing this book, but your future book. What I'd like to hear a bit about, if you're willing to talk about, because I can see kind of where you're headed and what needs to be discussed, and how water helps in that broader and very, I would say, fundamental conversation about the biography of people, let alone of how we manage water. Um, I was wondering if I could ask just a few questions, kind of stepping back from the book, as far as how you see your book fitting in with the a broader conversation and in conversation with other books and dialogue, so to speak. One that certainly comes to my mind is, it's very much a book of ideas and how ideas and water development interrelate. Reisner's Cadillac Desert certainly comes to mind, focused on the Western United States. Yours sort of, to my mind, updates it and globalizes that conversation about the ideas behind water development, both in the past as well as looking forward into the future. What other books do you see your book in dialogue with, either reinforcing or challenging each other's arguments, if any?
I think and this is part of why I've been writing this new project, which is about generalizing this point around environmental, about the Republican institutions, right? Because I started out this book writing in the theme of a number of water books, Cadillac Desert being an obvious example. I suppose that what I was trying to do was to move away from the sort of burning platform narrative, right? So a lot of these books end up making, and legitimately so, but the story basically typically is, there's fire, so beware, pay attention. That's kind of the basic story. And often this is then, sprinkled with a good measure of Manichaeism. There's good people and bad people. And the baddies are doing all these things, and the corporations and the people over there. Who the baddies are depends on kind of where you live in the sort of political spectrum, but fundamentally is a story of good versus evil, bad versus good. And I find that narrative profoundly dissatisfying and unproductive, because in the end, as I said earlier, I don't think there is a right answer to these problems. There's a legitimate answer that emerges out of some synthesis amongst people that disagree. Because obviously, if all of us could have our own way, we'd probably come to an optimal solution for ourselves. But the reality is that, water is a world of second best solutions, right? I mean, that's always how it is. Also because it takes time to build the stuff. So by the time you're done, you probably have changed the problem. And so you're always chasing something, right? You're never quite solving the problem today. You're building today the problem you imagine you will have tomorrow, but by the time you get to tomorrow, the problem will be different, right? And so it's sort of, I think those stories of good and bad and burning platforms and apocalypses, if we do nothing, we'll all die. That stuff is sort of, I find it, unconvincing, let's say, and I'll restrain myself from using other language, but also unproductive, in that I think that, particularly as it pertains to the climate problem and the changing nature of our hydrology, which is, just an empirical fact. I mean, California has seen this for the last 20 years. Things are changing. And so the nature of the problem we're facing has changed with it. So when I started working on these issues in the 90s, you could have essentially summarized the problem as a pollution problem, where you said, let's paint a picture of the distant future to convince ourselves that we don't want to go there, so that we fix stuff today, we change energy mix and we do things so that nothing really changes, and we never get into that future that we don't want to see. That train has left the station, right? So we're no longer in a situation where we ought to be debating, oh, let's fix emissions so that nothing changes. That's not an available option. The planet's changing. Just to kind of give a sense of scale here, in 2023, Canada had some remarkably destructive fires. Some of you will remember this. Certainly, if you lived on the East Coast or along in Chicago, Detroit, you would have seen this. 15 million hectares of land burnt. That's somewhere around 30 million acres, right? And 3 gigatons of CO2 were dumped into the atmosphere as a result. That year, concentration of CO2 jumped 3 parts of the parts per million. And that had nothing to do with our emissions. That had everything to do with these unmanaged fires. And these were not, these fires are in the boreal forest of Canada, they're basically lightning strikes, right? That just happen and ignite these things. So stuff's changing around us. And so now we will have to make some choices about what the infrastructure that we need is. Do we raise the levees? Do we move the town? Do we insure what we have at risk of flooding? Do we draw more water from over here than over there? Do we save this conservation area or provide water for these things? I mean, there's been some debate in California recently on these things. And the reality, I mean, they're legitimate questions. I mean, at the end, somebody's got to decide, and the decision better be legitimate, right? Meaning it has to be the expression of a collective discussion.
We certainly hope so.
Well,
Yeah.
what can you do? You can just keep trying, right?
That's right.
And so I think that's the problem, right? And in order to get to that, I mean, nobody in their right mind would think that this is going to be just brute force. Somebody decides what the answer is. It's infrastructure. It's in one place. We all live here. You know what I mean? It's like it's not. Like whoever doesn't get what they want can't just move somewhere else. I mean, we all have to live with the consequences of the choices we make, and we should all be aware. And this is really important, that however smart you think you are, however smart you think your solution is, by the time it starts working, the problem will be different. So, it's always going to be imperfect.
Yes.
It's always going to be ineffective to some extent, right? So it's really important that the institutions that come to make that choice are not just the expression of somebody who had power in that moment, right? Because it's not a particularly smart way to go. So that's what I wanted to say. So in a way, as I was writing, I found myself in dialogue ever more with books that talk about that problem. Hannah Arendt and, the people that ask themselves, well, how does a society a free society comes to sensible decisions without everybody having to agree on anything, right? On everything. That's really the heart of the political question. And maybe the book that was most powerful in my writing was Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition. Which was interesting because she was in this book. She was actually dealing with the question of what do you do in the nuclear age when the scientists have brought the power of the cosmos on Earth, and they use language to describe it that nobody understands but themselves, right? So how do you deal with that? And Hannah Arendt's point was we cannot allow decisions about our lives to be delegated to people whose language we don't understand. We are the zoon politikon. We are the political animal. We speak our politics. We author our lives. And we can only do that if we describe problems in language that we all understand. Right? So this whole business of scientists deciding what needs to happen, it's neither here. I'm a scientist, so there. But that's not the role of science. It never was. It never will be. Right? The questions are fundamentally about politics, about debating what we want, not what is, but what is right and legitimate, which is we can only decide together. And so, oddly enough, the books I've been kind of in dialogue with are more books that worry about that. They may not speak about water,
sure,
but really they're talking about kind of the nature of the choices that we have. And to me, they spoke of water, and that's what I tried to do with this book.
It's such an incredible dialogue and dialectic, as you described it earlier, between different things that we do have to manage, obviously water being a huge one, and how politics interrelates, adapts, and hopefully allows us to make these collective decisions. I'm absolutely fascinated, and I deeply appreciate your efforts in this book, and I can't wait to read your future book as you going on in creating and participating in this incredibly important conversation. I have one last question for you, and I'm just kind of curious. As I mentioned in the introduction, your books received significant, well-deserved accolades when it was published, and it was well distributed internationally. More recently, I've seen it on shelves of my local bookstores. Congratulations! It's well represented as it should be, and I'm so happy to see that. How has your book continued to be received by the reading public 4 years after its publication? What's your sense of its ongoing existence out there as you move forward?
I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I wrote it hoping that it would have a long shelf life. And it is helped by the fact that it's now also out in paperback, and
yes,
so that helps sort of maintain its distribution. My sense is that it has resonated most with practitioners. I've noticed that where I get cited and where it's, people sort of start reflecting on the message is in the community of people that work with water, that have dirt under their fingernails, as you might say. And it's interesting, the inspiration, the personal inspiration for writing this book was a guy called John Briscoe, who was a professor at Harvard, and before that he was the head of water at the World Bank for many, many years.
Ah.
And he was a water engineer by training. It's an extraordinary life. And he was always, he was an academic at some level. He had taught, and he was a professor at Harvard, so you can imagine. But at the same time, he always had great respect for the practitioner community, for the people that then have to face the music and make choices that on paper it might not look efficient or effective, but in fact, they are the things that work, right? He's the guy that made this point about, it's always a world of second best solutions. And I learned an enormous amount from John, and he passed away the year before. I started writing the book when he passed away, essentially, because in a way, it was a way for me to continue a dialogue that I'd had with him over the years. And it's sort of rewarding to see that it's people like him, or people that think like him, that have responded the most to the book. But then my hope is that over time, people can use it as a resource, right? And be something that, people can learn. I mean, at some level, it's a re-rising of history that people are even familiar with, but seen through the lens of water. And even if it's just that people get, even if they just notice water there in the corner of the history that they already knew, that would be already I think a major achievement. So it's interesting how it's evolving, and I hope it continues to be read and make some contribution to water literacy around the world.
I consider that a guarantee. It's an immense achievement. It's an incredible look at history and a reimagining and understanding of how water and humanity have worked together to get us to where we are, and hopefully to where we're going in as successful a way as possible. I just want to say how deeply grateful and appreciative I am for your time and appearing on the podcast. This was an amazing conversation. I learned a lot just talking with you and on top of the book, and I really look forward to reading your future works, and I just very much appreciate your time, sir, and your expertise.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you, Justin. It's been a real pleasure to be with you.
It's been a pleasure to be with you. We've been speaking with Dr. Giulio Boccaletti about his book, Water, a Biography, published by Pantheon in 2021, available both in hard and in soft cover, and available wherever you find books. Please pick up this book and benefit from it as I have. Thank you again so much, Giulio. I deeply appreciate this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Water Shelf. For water book news and reviews, and to sign up for our newsletter, please visit the Water Shelf website at mavensnotebook.com/watershelf. Maven's Notebook is the place to stay up to date on California water news and information. Subscribe to weekly or daily emails at mavensnotebook.com. Finally, please support authors by filling your water shelf with their amazing books. Buy them at your local bookseller and let me know what you think. Until next time, thank you for listening, and happy water reading.